My father died on a Tuesday in October, and I found out about the warehouse on a Thursday. The grief counselor told me the mind processes loss in stages. What she didn't tell me was that sometimes loss comes with a filing cabinet's worth of secrets that someone else has already been picking through. My father was a structural engineer for 31 years. He built things quietly and methodically, the way some men garden or fish. He wore the same brand of boots for 2 decades. He drove a truck with a cracked dashboard he refused to replace because, he said, everything worth keeping shows its age eventually. He died of a heart attack at his desk at 6:40 in the morning, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee 400 miles away. I work as a forensic accountant. I find money that people try to hide. I trace numbers through shell companies and dummy accounts and layered transactions the way a doctor reads a scan, looking for the thing that shouldn't be there. My father used to say I got his eye for structure, just applied it to spreadsheets instead of steel. He was right. It's the same instinct either way. I did not cry at the funeral. I stood in the front row in a black coat and held my younger sister's hand while she shook beside me, and I kept my face the way I'd learned to keep it in deposition rooms when the other attorney was lying and I had to wait for the right moment. Still, controlled, not because I didn't feel it, but because I had been trained by years of work and, honestly, by him to feel things after the task was done. The task at the funeral was to stay upright. My sister is 22 and was still finishing her degree when our father died. She cried through the entire service and leaned against our uncle's arm like he was the only solid thing in the room. Our uncle is my father's older brother. He used to bring us chocolate when we were small and helped coach my sister's soccer team the year she was 12. I had always thought of him as peripheral to our family present at holidays, reliably cheerful, never particularly essential. I had no reason then to think of him any other way. We met with my father's attorney 9 days after the service. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and pale wood, the kind of space that says money without shouting it. My sister sat beside me, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. My uncle sat across the room in a wingback chair like he'd been invited, which none of us had questioned, because he was family, and it didn't occur to me yet to question what family meant. The attorney, a precise woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, opened a folder and looked at me directly. She said my father had left his personal assets to my sister and me in equal measure, which I had expected. Then she said he had also left something else. A property, she said. A warehouse and office complex in Claremont, Ohio, registered under a holding company called Meridian Structures LLC, which my father had incorporated 11 years ago and which I had never heard of in my life. I said, a warehouse. She said, approximately 48,000 square feet, plus a 3-acre lot. He purchased it a decade ago. He's had it quietly maintained since. The deed transferred to you upon his death, along with his 51% stake in the LLC. My sister looked at me. I looked at the folder. There was a sealed envelope with my name on it. There was a key on a plain steel ring, no label. There was also a USB drive, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, taped to the inside of the envelope with a strip of yellowed Scotch tape, his handwriting on a sticky note attached to the drive. Watch before you go. My uncle shifted in his chair. He said that this was quite a surprise, wasn't it? He said he'd had no idea either. He said it with a particular kind of smoothness that I didn't register then because I was still reading the sticky note in my father's handwriting. The attorney asked me if I wanted a moment. I said no. I wanted the rest of the folder. There was a caretaker, she explained. A man named Cal Reeves who had managed the property for the past 8 years. My father had left specific instructions. Cal was to meet me at the property before I made any decisions. I was not to discuss the property with outside parties until I had been to Claremont. The phrasing was precise in the way my father was precise about everything, not dramatic, just exact. My uncle offered to drive us. He said Ohio was too far to go alone, that it was a long trip, that he wanted to help. He said it the way someone says, I'll carry that when they've already put their hands on the bag. I told him we'd be fine. He smiled and said, of course. And then his eyes went somewhere briefly that I filed away without yet knowing why. That evening, I sat in my hotel room and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. My father's face appeared on the screen. He was sitting at his desk at home. The one with the cracked lamp he also refused to replace. He looked healthy, or at least not sick. He looked like himself, which was the hardest part. He said, "Nora, if you're watching this, I'm gone. I want you to know that what's in Claremont isn't an accident. I built it quietly because I needed time to get things in order before I involved you. The warehouse sits on the only viable corridor for the Claremont Knox industrial expansion. 3 companies have been in preliminary talks with the city for 2 years, and whoever holds that property controls the access easement. I've been approached 6 times. I turned them all down because I wasn't ready." He paused. He ran a hand across his jaw. He said, "Your uncle has known about the property for 4 years. I made the mistake of trusting him with some early conversations. He has been approaching those same companies behind my back, telling them he represents the family's interests. He's accepted money. I don't know how much yet. Do not let him near this until you understand what you're holding. Go to Claremont, talk to Cal, look at what I built, then decide." He looked at the camera one more time and said, "I should have told you sooner. I was trying to protect the timeline. I'm sorry." The video ended. The room was very quiet. I sat there for a while with my hands flat on the table. Then I opened my laptop and started searching for Claremont, Ohio. The drive took 6 hours. My sister slept most of the way and woke up somewhere outside Columbus asking where we were stopping for coffee. I told her we'd stop when we got there. She asked why I looked like I was going to work. I said because we were. She didn't know yet what was on the drive. I needed to see the property first. I needed to understand what I was explaining before I explained it. Claremont was a mid-sized city trying to grow faster than its infrastructure allowed. The kind of place where 3 new apartment buildings had gone up beside a shuttered factory and no one had sorted out where the roads were supposed to go. The industrial district on the south end was older, brick and loading docks and long flat lots. But the north edge of it bumped against a corridor that the city was quietly redrawing. My father's warehouse was on that edge. I could see why companies wanted it the moment we pulled onto the access road. It sat on a corner lot with rail access on 2 sides and direct connection to the new freight arterial the county had poured 4 years ago. The building itself was clean, not flashy, but maintained. New roof panels. Fresh exterior paint on the eave lines. Small solar array on the south face of the lot building. A man was waiting at the gate. Late 50s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He shook my hand and said he was Cal. He said my father had told him to expect me. He said he was glad I came before anyone else did. I asked what he meant by that. He said, "Someone tried to get into the main office block 2 nights ago. They got as far as the secondary entrance before the alarm triggered." I pulled the footage this morning. Inside the main building, the air smelled of clean concrete and machine oil. The office block in the back was modest, a conference room. A row of filing cabinets, a server rack with a blinking green light. On the main desk sat a flat gray case. Cal told me it was a backup hard drive. Everything mirrored from my father's home system. There was a handwritten note taped to the lid. "Start here." My sister stood in the middle of the room looking at the filing cabinets. She said, "He really had all this." Cal said, "He drove out here twice a year. Usually alone. Sometimes with the attorney. Never with family." She looked at me. I was already opening the gray case. Inside the office, we found the first real evidence of how long my uncle had been operating. My father had been meticulous. There was a printed email chain going back 3 years, my uncle writing to a commercial real estate investment group out of Cincinnati, telling them he had controlling family authority over the Meridian property and that he could deliver a signed easement by the following quarter. The emails were polite and confident. He used the word "we" throughout, as if my father and sister and I were all behind him. There was a wire transfer record. $400,000 into an account registered to a holding company my uncle had incorporated 2 months after my father first told him about the warehouse. My sister read the printout over my shoulder and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Is that his signature on this?" It was not his signature. It was an approximation of it close enough to fool someone who hadn't studied it. I had spent 8 years studying forged signatures professionally. I could see the hesitation in the pen pressure on the second letter of the last name. I said, "That's a forgery." She sat down in one of the rolling chairs. Cal said there was more. He led us to a locked secondary room behind the server rack. Inside was what my father had called in a label on a manila folder, the working file. It contained everything. the original purchase documents, the city's preliminary expansion maps, letters from 3 separate companies expressing interest in long-term lease agreements, and a draft contract my uncle had attempted to circulate with his forged signature and a fabricated addendum naming himself as managing trustee. There was also a note in my father's handwriting, separate from the others, paper clipped to the inside of the folder. It said, "I found out in March. I didn't confront him. I started collecting instead. Everything you need is in this room. Use it before he does." I took photographs of every page. That evening, my uncle called my sister. I was in the kitchen when it happened. She had her phone on the table and I could hear his voice through the speaker without meaning to. He said he'd heard we were in Claremont. He said he was worried about us, 2 women alone managing something this complicated. He said he had experience in commercial real estate, that he'd been helping your father, he said, not our with some preliminary conversations, and that it would be a shame to lose that momentum now. He said he could come out, that it wasn't any trouble, that family should be there for each other. My sister looked at me. I shook my head once. She told him we were handling it. She hung up before he could respond. Then she set the phone face down on the table and said, "How long has this been going on?" I told her what I knew. All of it. I showed her the photograph of the wire transfer on my laptop. I showed her the forged signature blown up on screen. She stared at it for a while and then said, "He sat next to me at the funeral." "I know," she said. He held my hand. "I know," I said. We didn't sleep much. I sat at the conference room table until past midnight going through the hard drive's contents. My father had organized everything with the same logic he applied to structural load calculations, primary documents at the top, supporting evidence filed by date, annotated summaries clipped to the front of each section. He had been building this for almost a year, quietly, without alarming anyone, waiting until the picture was complete. I thought about how he'd said, on the video, that he should have told me sooner. I thought that he'd probably been trying not to worry me. That had always been the problem. He managed things quietly right up until he couldn't anymore. In the morning, Cal knocked on the office door and told us a car had parked at the end of the access road before dawn. It sat there for 40 minutes and then left. I asked if he'd gotten the plates. He handed me a still from the security camera. I sent it to the attorney. Then I called my contact at the firm I used for forensic verification work and asked her to run a background search on my uncle's holding company. She called back in 2 hours and told me there were 3 separate investor agreements attached to that company, all contingent on delivering a signed easement for the Meridian property. Total commitments, just over $1.2 million. He had promised something he had no legal right to give. The attorney filed an emergency hold on any transfer or encumbrance of the property that afternoon. She also sent a notice to the 3 investor groups informing them that the signatory on their agreements had no authority to represent Meridian Structures LLC and that all commitments were under legal review. That evening, my uncle left my sister a voicemail. His voice was different this time, still smooth, but compressed, like something being held under pressure. He said she needed to understand what I was doing to the family. He said I had always been the one who made things complicated. He said if she would just talk to him, he could fix this without lawyers. She played it on speaker at the kitchen table and then deleted it. She said, "He's scared." I said, "He should be." The next morning, a small article appeared on a regional business blog. The headline described a family dispute holding up a major commercial development deal in Claremont. It quoted an unnamed source calling me obstructionist and suggesting I was unfamiliar with commercial real estate timelines. The article mentioned no names directly, but it described the Meridian property specifically and noted that a concerned family member was attempting to mediate. Cal read it on his phone and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts grim and unsurprised. My sister said, "He's doing the same thing he did to Dad, talking to people behind your back." I said, "I know." And I said, "Let me make some calls." I contacted the commercial real estate columnist at the regional paper not to pitch a story, but to offer a background briefing. I gave her access to the city's expansion maps, the original purchase records, and a summary of the legal hold. I told her nothing about my uncle directly. I let the documents speak. Then I called the representative from the largest of the 3 investor groups. She picked up on the second ring. which told me she'd been expecting me. I told her I was the legal owner of the Meridian property, that I was aware of the commitments made in her agreement, and that I was prepared to have a direct conversation about the property's future as soon as the legal matter was resolved. I told her no legitimate agreement would be delayed by the truth, only by its absence. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your father's name is on our original correspondence. The other party told us he was acting on your father's authority." "My father died 11 months after that correspondence was sent," I said, "and he never authorized anyone to negotiate on his behalf." Another pause. Then she said, "I think we need to meet." I said, "I think so too." Cal had a contact at the city planning office, a woman he'd known for years who handled the expansion corridor applications. She agreed to come to the property the following afternoon. She brought maps. She showed us where the easement lines were drawn and where they had been proposed to shift in preliminary discussions with the investor groups. The shift, she said, would increase the Meridian lot's strategic value by something close to 40%. Whoever controlled that property in the next 18 months would be sitting on a decision point for the entire North Industrial District. My sister sat across the table looking at the maps with an expression I recognized from our father. The kind of focus that comes when something stops being abstract and becomes structural. She said, "And nobody told us any of this was happening," the planning contact said. "We were told the family was in agreement. We had no reason to question it." I slid the forged signature document across the table. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at me. I said, "We're going to need the city on record about who actually has standing to negotiate these easements." She said she would make sure of it. That night, my uncle showed up at the property. Cal saw him on the camera feed a car at the main gate, just sitting. He didn't ring the intercom. He didn't call. He sat in the car for 22 minutes and then drove away. Cal logged it with a timestamp and sent the clip to the attorney. I stood at the window of the office looking out at the empty lot and thought about the voicemail he'd left my sister, how precise the pressure had been in his voice. He wasn't panicking yet. He was calculating. I had spent most of my career across the table from people who were calculating. I knew what it looked like and I knew what to do next. I called the attorney and told her we were ready to move. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, at a neutral location, a law firm's conference room on the top floor of a building in downtown Columbus. All clean lines and indirect lighting, the kind of room designed to keep temperatures low. My sister and I arrived early. Our attorney laid out the folders. I kept mine closed. My uncle arrived with his own attorney, a man I didn't recognize, and a leather portfolio that looked like it had been purchased recently. My uncle was wearing a jacket I'd seen him wear to my cousin's graduation years ago. He looked like a man who had decided to appear trustworthy. He said my name when he came in. He said it warmly, like we were at a family dinner. He said he was glad we could all sit down together. I said, "Let's start with the property." The mediator reviewed the situation, the legal hold, the competing claims, the investor agreements. He asked my uncle's attorney to present their position. The attorney said his client had been involved in preliminary development discussions at my father's request, and that the agreements were entered in good faith on the understanding that my uncle had implied authority to negotiate as a family representative. The mediator asked for documentation of that authority. There was a pause. The attorney said they were prepared to argue implied authority based on long-standing family and business relationships. I opened my folder. I laid the forged signature document on the table. I said, "This is a document your client circulated to investor groups. It bears a signature purporting to be my father's. Here is a certified copy of my father's actual signature from the same period. The variation pattern in pen pressure and letter formation is consistent with forgery, and I have a written opinion from a certified document examiner attached as Exhibit 2. My uncle's expression didn't break, but his attorney's did, briefly, just a flicker, before he put it back. I laid the wire transfer records on the table. I said, "Your client received $400,000 from an investor group in exchange for a promised easement over a property he had no legal authority to encumber. That is a violation of securities regulation and potentially criminal fraud. We have filed a referral to the Attorney General's office." My sister sat to my right with her hands flat on the table. She was looking at him. Not with anger, with something quieter and harder than anger. Recognition. My uncle said, "Nora, I was trying to protect what your father built. He was getting older, and the companies were circling, and someone needed to act. I said, he was 58. And he had already acted. He just didn't tell you. The mediator asked if there were additional documents. I slid the final exhibit across, the video transcript. My father, on record, describing exactly what my uncle had done and why he had kept it from him. My uncle looked at it for a long time. His attorney leaned in and whispered something. My uncle shook his head. His attorney said something else, more firmly. My uncle looked up. He said, "What are you asking for?" Our attorney said, "A complete withdrawal of all claims to the property or its governance. Dissolution of the agreements with the investor groups, funded from your client's retained payment. A signed declaration that he has no familial or financial authority over Meridian Structures LLC. In exchange, we will not pursue civil damages beyond recovery of the funds already distributed." My uncle said, "And the criminal referral?" Our attorney said, "That's already filed. We can't withdraw it. What we can do is cooperate with any investigation, which will be noted." His attorney whispered again. My uncle stared at the table. I watched his jaw move slightly, the way someone's does when they're doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the answer. He said, "Fine." He signed the withdrawal. His attorney signed as witness. The mediator stamped it. My uncle left without looking at either of us. My sister exhaled slowly beside me. She said, "That's it." Our attorney said, "That's the legal part. The rest is up to you." Outside, the October air was sharp and dry. Columbus on a weekday morning, delivery trucks, pigeons, a woman in a yellow coat walking very fast. Normal things. I had forgotten normal things existed. My sister stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building for a moment. She said, "He hugged me at the funeral." I stood beside her. I said, "I know." She said, "I keep thinking about that." I said, "Me too." She was quiet. Then she said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we go back to Claremont." We went back that afternoon. Cal had coffee waiting. He'd also fixed the secondary entrance lock and installed 2 new cameras on the east face of the building, which he showed me on his phone with quiet satisfaction. We sat in the conference room with the city planning contact and the representative from the investor group who had called me back. Cal had set out folding chairs and a table covered with the original maps. Afternoon light came through the high windows in long angled bars. I told them what had happened. No spin. The documents, the mediation, the outcome. I told the investor representative that her company had been defrauded, that we were not the source of that fraud, and that we intended to develop the property lawfully and with the long-term interest of the corridor in mind. She said, "What does that mean practically?" I said, "It means we want to negotiate directly, starting from the actual deed and the actual maps, not from whatever was promised in those forged agreements. It means we have a say in what gets built here and under what conditions. And it means the easement isn't going to the highest bidder, it's going to whoever's willing to sit down and agree to standards my father set before any of this started." She looked at the maps for a moment. She said, "He had specific environmental covenants drafted." I said, "I know. We found them in the working file." She said, "The other group we spoke to never mentioned those." I said, "No. He wouldn't have." There was a pause. She looked at Cal, who looked at me. She said, "I think we can work with this." My sister had been quiet through most of the meeting. She was at the far end of the table with a legal pad, taking notes the way she used to take notes in class, in careful columns with the date at the top. When the investor representative left and Cal went to walk her out, my sister put her pen down and looked at the maps still spread across the table. She said, "Can I be involved in the negotiations?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know anything about commercial real estate." I said, "You're learning right now." She almost smiled. She said, "He would have liked this. The part where we're doing it ourselves." I thought about the video. I thought about him sitting at his desk, that cracked lamp behind him, looking straight into the camera and saying what he should have said years earlier. I thought about the way he'd organized every document in that office, not to hide them, not forever, but to have them ready for the moment when they were needed. He hadn't been hiding from us. He'd been building a case for us, the same way he built everything. Support first, then structure, then you show it to the people who need to see it. I said, He built all of this so we'd be ready when the time came. She nodded. She looked at the map, at the property lines, at the penciled notes in our father's handwriting along the margins. She said, "Then let's not waste it." Cal came back in and closed the door against the cold air. He poured 3 cups of coffee and set them on the table without being asked. He said, "The east camera picked up a clear morning angle. I'll set the motion threshold tonight." I said, "Good. Then I want to do a full perimeter walk tomorrow, and I want to pull the city's updated expansion schedule so we know what the timeline looks like going into the new year." He nodded and sat down. The 3 of us worked at the table until the light through the high windows turned gold and then gray. Outside, the freight trains moved along the far edge of the lot on their slow evening schedules, the sound of them rolling through the walls in a steady low vibration that felt, after a while, like its own kind of heartbeat. My father's key lay on the table between the maps and the coffee cups. The same plain steel ring, no label. I'd been carrying it in my jacket pocket since the attorney's office, and I kept finding my hand around it without meaning to, a reflex, the way you reach for something familiar when you're deciding what comes next. I left it there, on the table, between the documents, next to my sister's notepad and Cal's clipboard, where someone could see it, where it didn't need to be hidden anymore. My father had spent 11 years building something quietly, at the edge of a city that didn't know yet what it was becoming. He'd done it alone because he thought that was safer. He'd been right about a lot of things and wrong about that one. The safety hadn't lasted, and the silence had given someone else room to operate, but the structure had held. Everything underneath was exactly where he'd left it, organized and documented and ready. That's what he'd built. Not just a property, a foundation. My sister was still writing when I closed my folder for the night. Her handwriting looked like his, the same slight rightward lean, the same way the letters connected without lifting the pen. I hadn't noticed that before. I noticed it now. Outside, the freight trains kept moving. The security light on the east camera blinked steady green. We had a lot of work ahead. Negotiations, filings, the planning commission meetings, the environmental covenants to review, my uncle's referral working its way through the Attorney General's office. There would be days when it moved slowly and days when something unexpected came up from a direction I hadn't thought to watch. But for the first time since my father's attorney had pushed that envelope across the table, the property felt like ours. Not because it was deeded that way. Because we understood it. Because we'd seen every corner of it, filed every piece of paper that mattered, and sat at the table with the people who needed to hear the truth. The key on the table caught the light from overhead, dull, ordinary, the kind of key you'd walk past without looking twice. The kind of thing that only means something once you know what it opens. I knew what it opened now. I put it back in my pocket and got back to work.